The White House said today that a broad Chinese hacking operation had infiltrated at least 8 American telecommunication companies.
Salt Typhoon.
As well as you look at Salt Typhoon, aggressive.
Based on what you know about Salt Typhoon.
The Chinese Communist Party has infiltrated the telecommunication systems here in the United States in a dramatic and unprecedented sort of way.
About the Chinese hackers known as Salt Typhoon.
What a great name, by the way. Salt Typhoon.
Salt Typhoon.
Salt Typhoon.
Salt Typhoon.
Oh man, this one's going to be fun. Welcome to the Intrusions in Depth podcast. I'm Josh Stepp. On this episode, I take a look at a highly requested group, Salt Typhoon. The introduction probably gave that away, though. And although this group has been active and on the radar of many security professionals for at least the last year or two, the group has gained notoriety and more attention from the general public. For most people, the following quote just felt confusing or out of place. They were often left asking, how serious is this? And the quote being, encryption is your friend, whether it's on text messaging or if you have the capacity to use encrypted voice communication, end quote. That was a direct quote from a CISA official, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, in advice given to Americans in December of 2024. And this was in response to a cyber attack on 8 at the time and now 9 confirmed telecommunications and internet providers 2 months prior, October 2024. Now, some were asking, why would a country put out a public statement like this? Why were they so late to disclose this? However, in layman's term, this meant use Signal or be a blue bubble purist for the iMessage users. Ugh, green bubbles. Gross. But under this guidance, there was a confirmation, an admission to the public that our telecommunications providers were pwned sideways. I guess for a more modern audience, they would say that they were cooked. No cap. Now, despite having some of the best public and private sector incident responders and hunt teams prowling the networks, the attackers still had not been evicted. Some even questioned if it was even possible to evict them, given how entrenched they had become. Telecommunication systems are vast, have numerous components, and was architected when everyone just kind of trusted the internet. Encryption wasn't something you needed because only universities and schools were on the internet after all. But who is this Salt Typhoon? The group Salt Typhoon is known by many names. Earth Estuaries from Trend Micro, Famous Sparrow from ESET, Ghost Emperor from Kaspersky, and UNC2286 by Mandiant or Google Mandiant. That's a hard one for me to adjust to. However, Salt Typhoon is Microsoft's name for the group and the name I'll be using as it's gotten the most traction. Microsoft's SEO and marketing teams are probably proud. Now, the group, active since at least 2019, targets telecommunications companies, government agencies, hospitality sectors, and technology firms globally. They have been extremely aggressive, especially in their targeting of telecommunications and internet providers worldwide. As you'll hear throughout this episode, this is their specialty of sorts. The attackers aim to intercept network traffic, exfiltrate sensitive data, and persist across critical infrastructure for a long time, usually targeting those with sensitive data, especially in the group's more mature phases. Like most groups, the targets and TTPs show maturity as the group gains experience. This is rather common. I mean, it's kind of human nature. But the speed at which this maturity of the Chinese tech industry, both legal and illegal, is occurring has put the West on alert. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. This specific group, Salt Typhoon, is associated with the Chinese MSS, the Ministry of State Security. For context, the role of this Chinese agency is similar to the roles of the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, here in the United States, but bundled all together in one department with one leader, closely aligned to the CCP, of course. Now, in this episode, I attempt to go broad and deep at the same time. First, I'll explore the history of Chinese cyber attacks and broadly discuss the two groups believed to be responsible for most of them. the PLA, the People's Liberation Army of China, and more recently, the MSS, the Ministry of State Security. Now, from there, I'll pivot to Salt Typhoon and take you through their attacks and their maturity of their operations. I'll talk about some of their custom malware, the TTPs, and their victimology. Then, I'll bring it home with more recent American-focused attacks. But before we do all that, let's not get sued.
The information presented in this show is sourced from publicly available materials and does not contain any classified or proprietary content. The views and opinions expressed are those of the host and guests alone and do not reflect the official policy or position of their employers or any affiliated organizations. Enjoy the show.
Before we get started, I think it makes sense to start with a caveat of sorts. Attribution for cyber attacks is challenging, and the threat reports, blogs, and other open source intelligence on these attacks are typically light on how they came to the attribution they did. It's a lot of hand-waving and the use of TLP trust me bro sometimes. So there may be some dispute over how the groups align or who carried out which attack. It's incredibly common for threat actors to use other reported on TTPs or malware to hopefully get a false attribution in the process. Broadly speaking, especially in the early days, Chinese cyber operations and attacks were focused on economic espionage or intellectual property theft, hoovering up large amounts of data on various products or technologies to reverse engineer and duplicate in Chinese markets, then export them back to the West, undercutting the Western capitalist markets with state-funded strategic goals. Then, once you get a monopoly on the market, you start jacking up the prices. This is advantageous as the Chinese manufacturers don't have to waste that pesky thing called time and resources on research and development. They have a finished product to just clone and then sell at the cost, or even subsidize if the CCP determines that this is a strategic initiative. And for what it's worth, this is one of the reasons that the current Trump administration is in favor of tariffs on Chinese goods, to level the playing fields or even give the edge to American-built goods. Now, traditional capitalists obviously think that this isn't fair, and Adam Smith is probably big mad too. But in today's globally connected world with different forms of government and different hierarchies and global power, it's what happens. And your mileage may vary on whether you think this is a good idea or not, or if you think the tariffs would even work, as there's a bit of nuance in all of this. But most people agree that this is quote-unquote not fair. The original inventor has to recoup some of the funds they use to bring this item to market, especially if they took out loans or something to float themselves with like a runway while developing it. Now, in the West, we have things to protect those inventors: copyrights, patents, trademarks, intellectual property protections. China doesn't recognize any of those United States protections. I know, that's a shocking revelation. And this is also where I think it's important to think about the paradigm shift you need to consider when talking about Western norms and Chinese norms, specifically around business. In China, the government is essentially the owners of businesses. So that's why it isn't weird to say that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is attacking companies to steal their corporate secrets for their own domestic businesses to recreate and resell. Or if the business gets too big and the CEO runs their mouth too much, they get disappeared for a while. Colloquially speaking, this is called being Jack Mod. But to us, it would be bonkers if we found out that the United States Air Force, who's the best at this, were using their keyboard commandos to steal corporate secrets from international businesses for the benefit of American businesses. That's a profoundly weird concept for people to wrap their heads around. In most cases, people in this case being Western citizens more akin to Western values of freedom and markets, it might not sound so strange to like authoritarian civilizations. Although I will admit, even though I find the executive order ceremonies really corny and kind of dumb, I would love to see the reaction on people's face if President Trump had some press conference where he signed an executive order or some public military order directing U.S. military units to conduct corporate espionage based on the rules of like the MSS or the PLA, or the Chinese reaction to that as well. I mean, InfoSec Twitter, or X, melted down when some anonymous source at the Pentagon was standing down offensive actions against Russia. I mean, for all we know, that could have been the cashier at the Pentagon's Charlie's spouting this nonsense. Imagine if they had a primary source. So, with all of this in mind, I want to go through some early attacks and see how we got there. And this is going to be a little rapid fire, as I don't want to get bogged down here, but I'll pause on some of the more prominent and important events. It's important to lay framework here. Also, I'm focusing on the cyber attacks as this is my jam. There's plenty of cases of Chinese companies forming joint ventures to steal secrets and have internal spies just straight up walk out the door with information. That happens. It leads to the strategic goals as well. That's not what I'm all about here. So, starting in 2003, Chinese attackers exfiltrated national security information from the Naval Air Weapons Station in China Lake, which, despite the name, is in Ridgecrest, California. It's where the Navy does testing and research. The information stolen included nuclear weapons tests, design data, and stealth aircraft data. Now, maybe this happened by chance, like the DNS wasn't routed correctly, so they saw the word China and thought it was theirs, but I doubt it. And then, in 2005, attackers infiltrated NASA's networks managed by Lockheed Martin and Boeing and exfiltrated information about the Space Shuttle Discovery program. Then additionally, in 2005, attackers gained access to the U.S. Department of Defense's network in an operation known as Titan Rain. That's a pretty prominent attack and probably warrants a future episode or like a mini episode in the future. But essentially, they targeted U.S. defense contractors, Army Information Systems Engineering Command, and Defense Information Systems Agency, DISA, and the Naval Ocean Systems Center, and the U.S. Army Space and Strategic Defense Installation. And this was one of the first attacks known to be carried out by the PLA Unit 61398. This is also known as APT-1, Comet Crew, and Byzantine Candor. APT-1 is a big deal, at least to me, and I'll definitely save that for a future episode. Now, in the summer of 2006, Chinese attackers got to work again. In July, the U.S. State Department's unclassified network was breached and sensitive information and passwords were stolen. In August of 2006, Chinese attackers got into the Department of Defense's non-classified NIPRNet and downloaded 10 to 20 terabytes of data. And then later in 2006, it was also disclosed that the attackers got into the U.S. Naval Warfare College. Then shortly after that, in 2007, the Pentagon announced that the Joint Strike Fighter project had been compromised and the attackers stole data related to the F-35 fighter jet. And while we're talking about 2007, in general, that was a very busy year. I think it was a combination of better detection methods and maturity of skills by the attackers and the defenders. So it's very likely that some early attacks weren't discovered at all, which is alarming, you could say. So in January 2007, the National Defense University discovered Chinese malware in its computer systems. In June of 2007, PLA attackers breached a Pentagon computer network serving the Secretary of Defense, and it forced the network to be shut down for more than a week. Following that, in September of 2007, the attackers gained access to the Department of Homeland Security's networks through a contractor and exfiltrated unclassified information to Chinese servers. Then, the big one, in December of 2007, when Chinese attackers successfully stole information from Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Los Alamos National Laboratory, and the National Nuclear Security Administration. Later on, in 2008, Chinese attackers infiltrated the networks of President Barack Obama and John McCain's presidential campaigns and exfiltrated information about future policy agendas. And just to reiterate that again, that is 2008. They also infiltrated the computer networks of the White House and obtained emails between senior government officials. This was most likely to help with negotiations and discussions between the world leaders. Not to leave the private sector out, though, in March of 2009, Chinese attackers got into Coca-Cola's network and stole trade secrets, information, including information related to the attempted $2.4 billion acquisition of Hainan Juice Company. Also, randomly, in March of 2009, Chinese attackers stole information from the office of Senator Bill Nelson in Florida. This was also around the time in which the Dalai Lama's computer networks were compromised. Also, I wouldn't even have thought that the Dalai Lama had computers, to be honest, but I guess they need something to edit those YouTube videos on. Now we get into some of the more significant accounts. In January 2010, Google announced that a sophisticated attack had penetrated its networks. More than 30 other companies were attacked as well. The goal, which Google attributed to China, was to collect technology to gain access to Gmail accounts belonging to activists and to Google's Gia password management system. This was a big deal as Google is a big company and prominent in the United States, and significant that the Chinese didn't really care about using their military on American businesses. There was also other attacks on companies including Adobe, Rackspace, Yahoo, and Northrop Grumman. Now, the motives, they appear to be espionage, but also they place malicious code in the wide open source code repositories of those companies, some of them at least, which in reverse would just be weird. Like if we turned the US military loose on TikTok or Alibaba. Now, this was dubbed Operation Aurora by Dmitry Alperovich, the then vice president of McAfee. The Aurora name comes from a file path discovered in the forensic artifacts of the attacker's computer. McAfee's CTO at the time, George Kurtz, was also heavily involved in the disclosure and the analysis of this attack. Those names may sound familiar as they went on to form CrowdStrike. Also, in 2010, NATO and the EU issued a warning that a number of cyber attacks against their networks had increased, with Russia and China being among the most active adversaries. Some things never change. In other words, those intrusions weren't entirely focused on just American companies. In March 2011, attackers breached RSA security and compromised the RSA Secure ID tokens. The stolen information was used in subsequent attacks carried out by China. These are like early MFA tokens that people would be given to log into sensitive programs. If you've ever worked in government, you've probably seen them on keychains or lanyards. Now, April 2011, a phishing campaign aimed at compromising hundreds of Gmail passwords and accounts for prominent people, including senior US officials, took place. They also attempted to steal technical data from the computer systems of Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Again. In February 2012, attackers once again stole classified information about the technologies on board the F-35 Joint Strike Fighters. Then, in March of 2012, NASA reported that Chinese attackers conducted 13 attacks against NASA computers in 2011. In one attack, the intruders stole 150 user credentials that could be used to gain unauthorized access to NASA's systems. An attack at the Jet Propulsion Lab, JPL, allowed intruders to gain full access to key JPL systems and sensitive user accounts. Now, around this time, China announced a strategic focus in their own military and space systems. Now, March of 2012, Trend Micro released information about Lucky Cat, a campaign that went after US-based activists and organizations and some Tibetan activists. June of 2012, DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, reported that between 2011 and 2012, Chinese attackers targeted 23 gas pipeline companies and stole information that could be used for sabotage purposes. Also around the same time, PLA Unit 61398, APT-1, attacked Digital Bond, a SCADA ICS security company, with a spear phishing attack. So now we have pivoted into critical infrastructure back in 2011 and 2012. And of course, Unit 61398 pops up again and again and again. And well, since we're here, speaking of Unit 61398, in February of 2013, Mandiant released their APT-1 report. This revealed that the PLA unit had attacked U.S. victims since 2006, including organizations in the IT, aerospace, and telecommunication sectors, among others. And like I said earlier, this was a really big deal, as it put Mandiant on the map and kind of highlighted and raised the bar of what an APT threat report looks like. Then, in March of 2013, President Xi Jinping assumed control of the country and things took off. In 2013, a Defense Science Board report found that PLA attackers had stole U.S. weapon system designs, including those for the PAC-3 THAAD, the Aegis, the F-18 fighter jet, the V-22 Osprey, the Black Hawk helicopter, and the Littoral combat ship. They also got into the Army Engineering's core inventory of dams and U.S. Transportation Command's networks. Then, throughout 2013, the attackers went after national defense contractors and large American oil and gas companies. Are we noticing a trend here? They also went after think tanks, probably in an effort to understand U.S. foreign policy on China or leverage this information in negotiations again. In response, in May of 2014, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted Chinese nationals and identified them as being members of the PLA Army Unit 61398. They alleged that the attackers targeted 6 American companies in the power, metals, and solar production industries and stole trade secrets and information. The reality is that there were likely more attacks, but these were the only ones that the DOJ had evidence in which that they could prove and felt comfortable releasing. No one thought that China would extradite these individuals back to the United States to face charges. But what can we gather based off this victimology? Maybe China saw the upcoming pivot to green energy and wanted to capture the market. Subsidize a strategic industry to get a monopoly, then, like we said, raise the prices to get the profits. Now, if you really want to go down the rabbit hole, you would say that they also funded groups and social media campaigns to push America towards green energy, or maybe parts of Europe. I mean, maybe that's getting a little conspiratorial. In August of 2014, the United States Investigation Services, with the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, had also been infiltrated, and the personal information of federal employees, including security clearance information, had been stolen. This was one of the first instances of part of the larger 2015 OPM hack. In January of 2015, Anthem, a health insurance company, was also compromised, and attackers stole data concerning approximately 7.8 million people from Anthem's computer networks. 2015 also had a ton of insider threats in various industries, with Chinese nationals straight up walking out the door or emailing private information to government handlers. Windmill designs, pharmaceuticals, all kinds of stuff. In 2015, things also got to the point where President Obama had bluntly issued a warning to Chinese President Xi Jinping, by name, that these attacks had to stop or the United States would be forced to take actions, possibly in the form of sanctions if they didn't. And this is important in my opinion. This was a clear line from the US government that Beijing was going too far. This signaled a pain point. Then, almost instantly, things got quieter, deep into 2016. U.S. Steel did accuse China of stealing proprietary information about steel production techniques for the benefit of Chinese steel producers. It's unclear whether this was an old attack discovered at the time or a fresh one, but for our purposes, I don't think it really matters. It's corporate espionage for the benefit of China. Same MO as before. But the point I'm attempting to make is that Chinese attackers slowed down significantly. Then the 2016 election happened. President Obama had reached his term limits, and Donald Trump had defeated Hillary Clinton to become the 45th president of the United States. There was also widely publicized accusations that Russia had influenced the results of the election. And honestly, I think a lot of people and important organizations turned their attention to Russia as a result. And when China wasn't the focus anymore, they quietly ramped up those attacks again. CrowdStrike released their report on Mustang Panda in 2017 about Chinese attackers targeting U.S. think tanks. In 2017, the CC Cleaner attack happened, where CC Cleaner was compromised and over 1 million users got the first stage of an attack. And then just 40 PCs received the second payload, which was a much more targeted stage of the attack. Now, among the victims in the second stage were Akamai, D-Link, Google, HTC, Linksys, Microsoft, Samsung, Sony, VMware, and Cisco. Although the success of that second stage across those various orgs doesn't appear to be high, at least there's not a lot of reporting on it. Nonetheless, though, this represents a more targeted, disciplined victimology, in my opinion. In the past, having access to millions of machines would have been too juicy to just pass up. However, now they realize that being loud would likely get them caught faster. In 2018, a U.S. Navy contractor was breached. The attackers stole 614 gigabytes of information. This includes data on supersonic anti-ship missiles for the U.S. submarines. They also took submarine radio room information related to the crypto systems used for sensitive communications. Additionally, they stole Navy Submarine Development Unit electronic warfare library and that contains details about the technology used in fighting, obviously. And all of this is confidential information. And as a note for my younger listeners, crypto as in cryptological algorithms for these systems. The Navy wasn't mining Bitcoin or some other fake money coins.
But it's my Top Gun meme coin, bruh.
Now, electronic warfare, or EW, is the use of electronic systems to detect, analyze, or counter enemy radar and communication signals. It's usually broken down into like EA, electronic attack, EP, electronic protection, and ES, electronic warfare support. Now, none of this is really top secret or anything. You can kind of look it up all online, but how it's actually done, the tactics of it is pretty sensitive. But you can see why China would be interested in this material. One, you can repurpose it to use it against the United States or other Chinese adversaries. Two, you know the capabilities and limitations of the American systems. Furthermore, submarines in general are rather secretive. I mean, pictures of their props are forbidden in most cases, and usually covered with shrouds so you can't track them acoustically. Attackers also target U.S. defense and engineering companies with ties to the South China Sea. Now, you could say that the South China Sea is another hotspot for Chinese activities and their loose interpretations of sovereign rights. In addition to Taiwan, China also lays claim to parts of the Philippines, Japan, and the Koreas as well. Now, 2018 also had reports of Chinese spies eavesdropping on calls made by President Trump on an unsecured phone, as well as stolen information from Navy contractors, including ship maintenance data and further missile plans. It was a rough year for the Navy. And to add salt to the wounds, also in 2018, the attackers stole hundreds of gigabytes of data from technology companies and various U.S. government agencies. It stole names, social security numbers, date of birth, salary information, phone numbers, and email addresses of more than 100,000 U.S. Navy personnel. And in an effort to overshadow their 2018 conquest, in 2019, Chinese attackers started early. Shortly after Chinese New Year, in March, attackers targeted Israeli defense firms and had connections to the United States military. In April of that year, General Electric's trade secrets concerning jet engine turbine technologies were stolen. Bayer, the pharmaceutical company, had prevented an attack targeting sensitive intellectual property. And then in May, it was discovered that Chinese intelligence services reportedly had been using alleged NSA hacking tools since 2014 or 2016. There's conflicting reports there. But for more than a year before those were publicly leaked. In July, Chinese attackers from the group APT-10 targeted 3 U.S. utility agencies with spear phishing campaigns to gain access to computer networks. Then in August of 2019, APT-41 was reported on, stating that since 2012, they had gathered data from the firms in telecommunications, healthcare, and semiconductor manufacturing, and machine learning. This group was also active in the theft of digital cryptocurrencies, or crypto, as the kids would say. Now, Mandiant has a pretty good report that I'll link through to it. In August, multiple U.S. cancer institutes were targeted to take information related to cutting-edge cancer research. And then staying once again in 2019, in October, reports came out outlining how China stole information from various Western aircraft companies for their C919 airliner. And for context, the C919 airliner is significant as it was China's first homegrown mainline passenger plane. It's a narrow-body airplane manufactured by the Shanghai-based state-owned Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China. It's also more commonly known as COMAC. Now, it was built to rival the popular Airbus A320 and the Boeing 737 platforms. And it's a way to solidify Chinese aviation's industry and establish China as a major manufacturer of passenger aircraft. Then, COVID kicks off. In response, in 2020, U.S. officials reported seeing a surge of attacks against healthcare providers, pharmaceutical manufacturers, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. They also alleged that the attackers stole information regarding vaccines. 2020 also had a ramp up of indictments and various insider threats being discovered in universities. CISA and the NSA warned about the MSS's efforts in ramping up the scanning of U.S. networks for vulnerable devices. Then, in December of 2020, Axios reported on a Chinese intelligence operation that allegedly occurred between 2011 and 2015, a 4-year period. Now, during this operation, a Chinese spy named Fang Fang targeted local and national politicians through networking, campaign fundraising, and romantic relationships, with the goal to gain proximity to political power and who knows what else. Now, the main congressman connected to this operation was a Democrat representative from California, Eric Swalwell. Swalwell sits on the House Permanent Select Committee of Intelligence. Now, pulling that thread further, this is a sensitive group that deals with the nation's spy stuff, like keeping America safe from other countries, sneaky plans, in theory at least. Now, Swalwell has been on this committee since 2015, and he even led a smaller part of it called the CIA Subcommittee, which focuses on the Central Intelligence Agency's work. Now, this committee has access to top secret information, which is why people got worried about Fang Fang, the suspected Chinese spy, getting close to him. But this isn't a civics class soap opera, so let's kind of stay on task. Getting into March 2021, Microsoft's email was compromised in order to steal data from over 30,000 organizations around the world, including government agencies, legislative bodies, law firms, defense contractors, etc., etc. Now, this was a Microsoft Exchange Server 0 day, which I'm going to go into more detail about, but was attributed to the Ministry of State Security. In October 2021, a Chinese-linked group gained access to call records and text messages from telecommunications carriers across the globe, according to a report by CrowdStrike. This was originally the Light Basin attacks, but now I think it's been revised to be Liminal Panda. The report outlines the group began its cyber attacks in 2016 and infiltrated at least 13 telecommunications networks, mostly focused in Africa and South Asia. And this kind of highlights one of the benefits of the Defend Forward missions carried out by the United States government in 2018 or so. Usually, these smaller countries are test beds for attackers before they go prime time. The idea is that Russia, China, etc., adversaries to the United States, don't expect US government or Western defenders to be on those networks. Now, this also gives Western defenders a chance to gather intelligence. November of 2021 had more defense contractors being breached. The attackers were observed and, well, I guess, along with everyone else, attempting to leverage Log4j exploits for initial entry. Going into 2022, there was initially arrest in connection to fox hunting, which I think I'll discuss in the next episode of the series. And I think this is a good place to wrap up the history, as most of the prominent stuff falls under the Salt Typhoon umbrella, and I want to explore that more in detail throughout this episode. Now, before I start to unpack Salt Typhoon more, this is a good time to discuss the nuances of threat intelligence reporting and just being in CTI altogether. Every organization clusters and groups activities based on what they see or analyze. While there may be overlap in TTPs, some firms may not agree on all the attacks being Salt Typhoon in this instance. In some instances of clustering, it would be subsets that fall under a broader Salt Typhoon umbrella. Once again, Salt Typhoon being the name from Microsoft. Now, this isn't unique to China. It happens with Russian, Iranian groups, financial groups. But in my opinion, I think the biggest offenders are when it comes to like the Lazarus group of North Korea. Some organizations group everything from North Korea as just straight up Lazarus, while others attempt to break it out into subgroups. I can see the utility in being precise, but I can also see how it happens. And by virtue of North Korean politics and cultural structure, economic circumstances, I don't know what you would call it, to be honest. But the point I'm trying to make is that because the government is structured there, along with the lack of things like internet or electricity, there's only going to be a small set of keyboard commandos likely tied to that government. All of this is to say that when I researched this episode, I took the more liberal approach when adding attacks attributed to the group in an effort to illuminate more of the picture. In other words, not every organization, company, or person agree on some of these attacks being tied to Salt Typhoon, and that may just be a matter of them not having enough details to feel confident in doing so. However, the consensus leans towards Salt Typhoon, and that's where I want to sit as well. Similar victimology, similar atomic indicators, similar outcome, similar tools, all of this falling under apparent espionage. The Cyber Safety Review Board, the CSRB, was working on a report that would have probably validated some of these, possibly. But now the new Trump administration has RMRF, that advisory board at DHS, and the CSRB is no more, which, in my opinion, is a big miss. The CSRB is needed and a good resource to the community, in my opinion. Not trying to defend the decision, but maybe if you are in one of these roles, you take a more apolitical approach. Maybe being less partisan. I guess that could be said for multiple roles in government. Like I said at the top of the show, Salt Typhoon is attributed to breaching 9 telecommunications providers here in the United States, which I think is a nice way of saying almost all of them, especially when most of the smaller providers fall under the broader network run by these bigger players. Now, the unsettling part of these attacks are that the extent of the data exfiltration remains unknown. While companies like T-Mobile have stated that they have not experienced any significant impacts to their systems or data, other companies had reported the compromise of customer call records and metadata. Now, US officials have revealed that the attackers were able to access metadata of some users and text messages, including date and timestamps, source and destination IP addresses, and phone numbers from well over 1 billion users, most of whom were located in the Washington, D.C. metro area. I wonder who all lives there. In some cases, they were also able to obtain audio recordings of telephone calls made by high-profile individuals. But this is all the more recent attacks that I want to circle back to. I think it makes more sense to start at the earlier attacks and work our way forward. Despite being an aggressive APT, looking at it this way gives us a chance to see the maturity of the group improve as the stakes got higher. Furthermore, it's important to realize that some of these campaigns overlap with one another. I'll explain my thoughts on why that's happening in a moment. The first documented campaign, or the early intrusions describing activities, started in 2019. Although some groups say it's 2020, the reality is that it's only a difference of a couple of months, and for our purposes, it doesn't matter. Overall, I'm grouping these early campaigns as Campaign 1 from 2019-2020 to August of 2022. There's a lot of activity, but it doesn't feel as targeted as the later campaigns. And I know that feel is a subjective word, but just roll with it for a bit. The early victimology was broad, both in geography and industrial segments. Targets ranged from the government, telecommunications companies, hospitality, technology, aviation, while being located in Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines, India, Indonesia, Afghanistan, and of course, Taiwan. Which, if we use the benefit of hindsight, you'll notice that these countries and these sectors keep popping up. Admittedly, there isn't a ton of research published for this group for this time frame. I think this is a mixture of 3 reasons. 1, besides the use of some custom malware, which I'll explain throughout this episode, the actual campaigns aren't all that novel, especially when it comes to Chinese groups breaking into things. I hate to sound jaded, but to most people, especially the ones listening to this podcast probably, a Chinese APT stealing data from an aviation company sounds a lot like any other Tuesday. Okay, I'm being a little hyperbolic, but the point is that this is common, and reporters and researchers usually don't see this as something worth reporting on, especially in the year 2025. It's usually custom malware that gets the researchers' attention, and this is usually in an effort to write detections or fingerprint the malware so they can have a signature to it, or something similar like that. Second, the targeted countries, with the exception of maybe Taiwan, Indonesia, and possibly India, aren't seen as technological countries. And this is hard to measure and thus hard to explain. The point I'm trying to convey here is that while the other ones I mentioned may have robust technological programs like semiconductors, chips, etc., they aren't seen as like hard targets compared to those in the West. And this isn't a we're better than them type of argument. It's a timing thing. As you've heard earlier, other Chinese groups have pwned American and European companies sideways. And as a result, the security controls and security programs have matured. They were iterated on and kind of battlefield tested. They're hardened. Supposedly. Some networks and security devices still suck. I believe countries like Japan and South Korea are in for a pretty rough time in the AI revolution. Japan probably more so. Attackers, specifically the extortion-seeking types, have always had a barrier to entry with the language. With AI translation, that's a lot easier. And I've watched quite a few documentaries on cultural Japanese things. For example, the Man Band series by Naoki Urasawa. Most of those manga artists, even those in publishing studios, are using old, and I mean old versions of Adobe Photoshop and Windows operating systems. I cringe when I see that Windows 7 background. And this isn't just for those studios. In Japanese video game studios as well, and this is a generalized statement, but with the focus on building, sometimes the focus on securing isn't there. Ransoming those targets could be an easy payday or possibly knock some of those places out of business. South Korea is kind of in the same boat. They do have their own friends from the north that like to stress test and probe them periodically. But in all honesty, I think they figured out it's way easier to just steal cryptocurrencies from the tech bro blockchain idiots here in the West with their janky exchanges than to go after South Korean targets that have a much smaller payday, and it's a lot more work to launder that money. Plus, shaking down South Korea organizations leave you exposed to them clawing back the cash or going after the bank accounts. Anyway, it's a bit of a tangent. The third reason is that when the world was starting to get wind of a virus in China, you may have heard of it, and that started to get traction, the already small group of people that cared about Afghanistan at the time had more pressing things to report on or care about. But what did come out of these campaigns were some interesting malware samples that researchers got their hands on. Early versions of Demodex, a rootkit, it was iterated on throughout these campaigns on how it was delivered and how/is a staple in this group's arsenal. It allowed the group to stay hidden, embedded in networks for a very long time. Now, Demodex is interesting as it's a rootkit, which is a harder way to do things in the 2020s. It appears that most of these were placed in telecommunication companies, so maybe there's like older operating systems involved. The first stage usually requires a PowerShell script and a decryption key as an argument. In later attacks, researchers found the command and control server with an example of this script, and I'll get there in a bit. But in these earlier attacks and some later attacks, they moved that PowerShell script around via PSExec. And I know probably every blue teamer just cringed a little. So if you're monitoring process events with the command line auditing on your 4688 events, or have a way to see the process arguments via like an EDR tool, this should be something that alerts or gets your attention. I know I've harped on this before, but even in 2019, most SOC people would yell at their admins for PSExecing all over the place. People still use it because they think dumping creds and looking shadiest in the logs is easier than WinRMing through dedicated jump boxes for WinRM. Now, some people would call that job security, and hey, my podcasts won't run out of content anytime soon as long as we keep doing that. Now, the second stage service loader uses the computer name as the decryption key, and this rootkit does some sneaky defense evasion things like control flow flattening. And if you don't know what that means, control flow flattening is a move that malware authors do to obscure the program's execution path by restructuring its code to remove the clear control flow structures like loops and conditionals. Thus, this breaks any useful diagrams you would see for it in Ghidra or Hydra Pro if you're rich or your company pays for it. There's also two other interesting pieces of malware from these early campaigns, Sparrowdoor and Ghost Spider. Now, Sparrowdoor is a backdoor widely believed to only have been used by this group. It's a 3-stage DLL hijacking implant, a favorite tactic of the group to get on the box, as you'll hear over the course of this analysis. But it communicates over HTTPS, port 443, and can go through a proxy or not. And extensive uses of proxies is also a favorite of Salt Typhoon. According to some ESET research that I'll put in the show notes, Sparrowdoor was utilized in a series of hotel attacks in 2021. I'm about to talk about those. But Ghost Spider is more interesting in my opinion, and I'll cover it in more detail for the later campaigns. However, it's important to note that this group, being as aggressive as it is/was, employed a large set of tools to accomplish their actions on objective. Custom pieces like those discussed earlier, some written in modern languages like Go, and the crowd favorite, open source proxies, interpreter payloads, Cobalt Strike beacons, PSExec, Shadowpad malware, and they shared malware with other known or suspected Chinese APTs. Now, these data points help us build a model of the group. First, the keyboard commandos are technically proficient, being able to deploy and utilize tools from various sources. Plus, having a dev team or the capability to write custom malware that works, especially through loading DLLs, shows some capability to reverse engineer known applications, or at least monitor the loaded libraries. Second, it's probably an APT or state-backed group due to the long-term nature of the campaigns and absence of ransomware, sort of, and not really caring if they're attributed or not. Usually, non-state-backed groups hit hard and go under the radar for a bit, or they resurface with a new name, or just stick to hitting places like Afghanistan. The problem with this is that those soft targets usually don't have anything worth stealing, and getting a payout from them can be difficult. Now, these actions, on the other hand, suggest that they have the backing of the government to do these actions, and thus they're not incentivized by profits or financial motives.
Hey, everyone. If you're enjoying this episode, I'd love for you to join the conversation over at IntrusionsInDepth.com. Sign up for my mailing list, and there you'll get exclusive updates and insights straight into your inbox. And while you're there, I could use your help to grow. Tell a friend, a coworker, anyone who would vibe with this podcast. Word of mouth is how we thrive, so let's make it happen.
We are now in the part of the journey where we talk about proxy logon, or more specifically, the set of bugs that make up proxy logon, and the sus disclosure or lack of. I'll link through to the official page, and maybe they have some merch on there or something if you're interested. All joking aside, proxy logon was a headache. But let's start from the top. Proxy logon refers to a set of vulnerabilities in Microsoft's Exchange server. This is what I talked about earlier during the history part, which were collectively discovered and exploited before their official disclosure. The threat actor doing the exploitation with the 0 day was known as Hafnium, or Microsoft would call them Silk Typhoon. Typhoon being the name for Chinese actors. And Hafnium was so prolific that Microsoft released IOC's tools and multiple blog posts to help the Exchange users search for signs of compromise by this group. Now, these vulnerabilities were primarily associated with the following CVE identifiers. CVE 2021-26855, which was a server-side request forgery SSRF vulnerability that allowed the attackers to send arbitrary HTTP requests. There was also CVE 2021-26857, which was an insecure deserialized vulnerability which could be exploited after the previous SSRF to execute arbitrary code. Then there was a post-authentication arbitrary file write vulnerability that allowed code execution after the SSRF. That was CVE 2021-26858. And then finally, there was CVE 2021-27065, which was a post-authentication arbitrary file write vulnerability similar to the last CVE, but it had a different exploit path. It's also worth noting that there was proxy oracle and proxy shell. Essentially, we are chaining SSRF with an NTLM relay. And I'll link through to the Orange Sci write-ups for those that are interested in reading this further. But what this did give was APTs and eventually criminals a way into networks via public-facing boxes, edge devices. Now, in this research, Salt Typhoon was utilizing the exploit to get access to hotels around the world. And just to be clear, they were still exploiting other targets as well, like law firms, factories, engineering organizations, and the crowd favorites, internet service providers, and telecommunications providers. I just felt like I need to clarify that. Now, after getting access to the internet-facing Exchange servers, the attackers got to work. Email servers are obviously a juicy target for espionage, but the group dug deeper. Once they got on the systems, they started dropping their own tools. First of all was a variant of Mimikatz, likely modified from the source and compiled locally. And then a utility that drops procdump, a Microsoft sysinternals tool, and attempts to dump the LSASS process in order to get secrets from memory, credentials. Then a NetBIOS scanner called MPT scan, and this was used for recon of the target environment. And then finally, there was the loader for Sparador, the backdoor. There's different variants of the Sparador backdoor out there, likely modified to be more effective or tailored for the different environments to avoid antivirus or outside scrutiny. But in one variant, the one analyzed here, Sparador is loaded via DLL hijacking.
Now, utilizing three elements, a legitimate K7 computing executable called indexer.exe, which acts as the DLL hijacking host, a malicious DLL, K7UI.dll, and encrypted shellcode in mpsvc.dll. These three files are all dropped in the program data software directory. Other variants utilize similar tactics but use different named DLLs, but I'll stick to the indexer.exe version. Once executed, the K7UI DLL patches indexer.exe, and this made a change to a jump. And this makes a process run in a section of the code within the .text section of the DLL called launcher. Now, this is a section within a PE file, a portable executable. And if you're shaking your head right now, like, what the is he talking about? Just bear with me. Essentially, they're using a legitimate process, rewriting it to launch malicious code from a different file. The other DLL dropped mpsvc.dll is where the magic happens. Being that it's encrypted shellcode, that's usually the key indicator that it's up to no good. But this launcher code launches mpsvc.dll into memory after being decrypted with an XOR function. The XOR key is just the first 4 bytes of the file. Now, mpsvc.dll, the encrypted shellcode, then proceeds to load the libraries needed to construct the PE file, build the executable. Then it locates the address of functions for use. Then it allocates memory with read, write, execute permissions, which is usually what gets these payloads caught with detections that look for memory payloads. Having all 3 of these is usually a flag worth considering, especially with how the payload looks on disk, but now we're getting a little into a tangent. Next, it copies shellcode segments into allocated memory to build the PE structure. Then resolves imports for several functions from various libraries. Then finally, after constructing the PE file, it is then executed without the headers on a hard-coded address in memory. Which is kind of suspicious. Once installed, this backdoor attempts to reach out to a C2 server without a proxy. If it's successful, it waits for instructions over port 443, TLS, encrypted communications. And if it can't reach the C2 server, it attempts to go through a proxy. Now, persistence is set through a registry run key and a service, which is created and started using the configuration data that's hard-coded in the binary format on the disk. Now, looking at the configuration file, we can observe the functionality of the backdoor. And it's pretty much what you would expect. File and directory permissions, so you can upload and download files to the server, manipulate directories, standard payload functions for a shell, to say the least. What is thoughtful, though, is the use of a kill switch, which is triggered when the backdoor is started with the TAT-K argument. When the kill switch is engaged, it removes the persistence and all the files associated with the backdoor. It's pretty nifty. Most people just leave their crap laying around. Around this time as well, Google Mandiant put out a TLP Red bulletin for UNC 2286, dubbing them the Cyber Concierge. This bulletin was essentially warning people about inauthentic extortion attempts to obscure their espionage purposes. Now, various threat actors have tried this from time to time. Chinese espionage crews releasing real ransomware to cover their tracks, which in my opinion breaks the espionage gentleman's agreement between nations. But then again, no one asked me for my opinions.
Shut your mouth, podcaster.
It looks like Salt Typhoon gave up that tactic as well in 2022. But let's pivot into thinking about some of the dynamics of these attacks. I want to emphasize that at this point, there isn't a ton of evidence to suggest that they're targeting Western organizations. And I believe this is for 2 reasons, and foreshadows a point. First, this is probably an example of targets of opportunity. These aren't specific targets to an organization as much as wide-scale Chinese scanning to find vulnerable servers on the internet. Early Chinese intellectual property theft stole some obscure plans that on the surface didn't make much sense. Thinking about this in the meat space world, if you left your car door unlocked on the street and someone ransacked it, they probably didn't know you. They probably just saw unsecured items in an unlocked car. This could also be a way for them to train and experiment with TTPs before hitting harder targets like those in the West. Second, having large data sets allow more correlation of potential targets, even seemingly boring data sets. With powerful AI models, you can process and weaponize that information quickly. Imagine dumping all of this into like a basic model like ChatGPT or like a Google Notebook LM, and then querying information and timelines that way. Now, hotels are especially juicy intel targets because you can track people of interest and where they're at. Couple that with other stolen data sets, and you can make some pretty nasty information operation campaigns. You don't like a politician that's running against you? Use stolen data to smear that person on your state-run social media app used by millions. Obviously, that's a joke at TikTok, which if that's your jam, I have an episode directly before this one talking about the TikTok ban. And people are saying it's the best podcast they've ever listened to. But you could do the same information operation smear jobs on American social media platforms too, or any social media platform in any country with the followership. It's the network effect that's being weaponized here. But putting a pin in all of that and however you voted and trying to remove any political bias, let's look at another example. Think about this in the 2016 context with the Russian collusion news cycles. Once again, remove any political bias you have. If a politician traveled to Russia a few weeks before announcing they ran for president, it wouldn't be hard to dump those anonymous sources to some enterprising journalist looking to cosplay being the next Glenn Greenwald and Eric Snowden show on New York City's Broadway or something. Maybe they would even get a movie made after them too. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but the point is that these records or blueprints, plans, etc. that are stolen can be used to advance China's strategic goals, even if it doesn't look valuable on the surface. They could be just used for a good old-fashioned media smear job, but keep that in the back of your head. But so far, we've seen cyber-espionage 101 with Salt Typhoon, using bugs and edge devices to get access, dropping payloads to move within a network and hoover up large amounts of data. This campaign, which I'm calling Campaign 3, occurred from November 2022 to November 2023. Now, during this time, we saw the group expand their toolkit beyond their earlier efforts. The attacks targeted vulnerabilities in Sophos firewalls and Fortinet devices. Specifically, Salt Typhoon exploited CVE 2020-12271 in the Sophos firewalls, along with 3 CVEs in the Fortinet devices. CVE 2018-13379, CVE 2020-12812, and CVE 2019-5591, if you're playing CVE bingo at home. Now, they also reused the proxy logon exploit chain that we discussed earlier as well. So basically, they had a lot of tools to do this. Now, before I go further, let's clarify some terms. CVEs, or Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, is a system that catalogs publicly known cybersecurity vulnerabilities in products. Now, each CVE entry includes an ID, a description, and a reference, and the idea is to help security professionals track and address flaws. CVEs are often paired with a CVSS score, a common vulnerability scoring system, which rates them based on a multitude of factors like attack complexity and the privileges needed to do it. And while this isn't mandatory, the score usually guides the prioritization and patching strategies for organizations. Additionally, the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities, the KEV catalog, highlights CVEs actively used in the wild, and this is hopefully to signal urgent action. Now, furthermore, some CVEs are for bugs that are truly one-off occurrences, which are usually forgiven by the industry if it's rare and novel. On the other hand, some vendors repeatedly put hard-coded credentials in their devices and allow for .. path traversal from their admin page. In other words, these are rather silly CVEs. So just because a vendor has a CVE, it doesn't make it good or bad. It usually requires digging one or multiple steps deeper just to see how bad it actually is. Now, I could probably devote an entire episode to how CVSS scores are calculated and discuss all the metrics and get into the weeds on CVEs, but that would get really boring really fast. Now, threat actors, attackers, hackers, whatever you want to call them, like Salt Typhoon, need 2 things: a way into a system and a way to operate once they're inside. Now, think of it like if you're trying to plant a hidden camera in someone's house. First, you need a way in, an unlocked door, a window, you could buy a key from someone, etc., etc. Then you need the camera itself. Now, if you're an idiot, once you're inside, you put like a giant studio camera from like a Hollywood set or something in the living room, and it's obvious and it's abundantly clear that someone was in there and where the camera is. However, if you were moderately skilled and you had some custom camera that was really small and difficult to find, you would opt to use that and not like bust in the door when you were doing it. Now, in the case of Salt Typhoon, the group exploited bugs in internet-facing devices for the most part. In real life, this would be like if they found a flaw in your lock or found a way to bypass them. Now, evidence suggests that Chinese researchers excel at finding these types of flaws, often using them before public disclosure, as we saw with proxy logon. Now, Chinese law also requires researchers to share the vulnerabilities with the government first, likely giving state-sponsored groups first dibs. Now, the name proxy logon is catchy and is kind of like a weird form of marketing. Bugs and exploits often get branded for easier recognition, and so you can sell merch and stickers. And I guess it's easier for like the salespeople or the field teams involved to say, hey, my product stops proxy logon instead of CVE 2021-26855. It just doesn't hit the same way. Now back to this campaign. Salt Typhoon's attacks hit a chemical company in Asia Pacific, the Taiwanese government, and several US NGOs, among others. Now, the exact victim details are sparse, but Trend Micro's reports focus on what I'm after, the tactics rather than the targets, and it offers solid insights. The group deployed their familiar Demodex rootkit, along with Cobalt Strike and FRPC, the fast reverse proxy, along with the PowerShell script for dropping a Ghost Emperor sample. This is a stealthy, memory-resistant payload linked to other Chinese APTs. They also introduced SnappyBee, a new payload that, like everything else, used DLL hijacking. SnappyBee isn't all that interesting, to be honest, except for meta details around it, like how it's delivered and where it's used elsewhere. Let's get into that. First, it shared a loader with another piece of malware called Zingdoor, which was another one of these custom-written payloads pretty much used for espionage purposes. Now, you may be asking, how did those dank blue teamers get all of their tools? Well, you remember how I said the Salt Typhoon was interesting because you got to watch their maturity along the way? Well, much like the first time a bully finds someone who isn't going to take their crap, Salt Typhoon found a set of blue teamers who weren't afraid to pants them for their operational security oversights. This key moment in the campaign came in October of 2023 when Trend Micro found an active Salt Typhoon command and control server on port 80. This server also doubled as a staging hub and exposed their tools and configs. And just to be clear, I would imagine that other groups found this server as well, but probably just didn't report on it. As prolific as the group is, I would imagine they're on a bunch of people's radar at this point. Now, researchers monitored it until April 2024, gathering intel. Then they published a report called Game of Emperor, unveiling long-term Earth estuaries cyber intrusions. And they detailed their findings. Note that Earth estuaries is Trend Micro's name for the group that Microsoft calls Salt Typhoon. Now, this lapse highlights some operational security gaps. First, the group didn't monitor server traffic against known victims, suggesting indifference or just oversight. Maybe they just didn't care to do so, or they didn't know that this was something they had to do. Maybe it's a mixture of both. Second, they kept the infrastructure active for far too long. Now, IP addresses and domains are easy to track, per the pyramid of pain model. Third, convenience likely trumped any caution, as locking down C2 servers can complicate access through victim networks, especially if the victim networks have a lot of hoops to jump through to get out of the gateway. Now, what did Trend Micro uncover? Well, files like sql.toml, which was an FRPC config for the C2 server, and ondrive.zip, which contained the PowerShell dropper ondrive.ps1. Now, FRPC is an open source fast reverse proxy client tool used to open a reverse proxy between the compromised server and a Salt Typhoon C2 server. And this is where they also found the SnappyBee samples. And since they were there for so long, they actually found multiple versions or variants of this as well. Now, other tools included FScan and Intranet Scanner and NeoReadGeo.org, a proxy tool both with Chinese instructions, which probably make them appealing to Chinese-speaking attackers. But let's circle back to the meta details that I was talking about with the deployment of SnappyBee. When we talk about a group like Salt Typhoon, it's not just one person behind a keyboard. We're looking at teams, multiple individuals, likely with different roles. You've got developers, maybe planners, and the hands-on operators, what I usually dub keyboard commandos. But here's the thing to pay attention to. Even those operators don't stick to one rigid playbook or one set of TTPs, tactics, techniques, or procedures, even within the same operation. This is an indicator of maturity within the organization and values to some extent. So what does this look like in practice? Well, imagine two operators working on the same attack. Operator A uses a tool like FScan to sweep the environment looking for ICMP packets, hunting for live systems. Operator B, though, might tweak FScan to look for like NetBIOS traffic instead. Trend Micro's report, titled Breaking Down Earth Estuaries, Persistence TTPs, and Prolonged Cyber Operations, gives us a glimpse of how this played out. Here's a quote. In one of the attacks we observed, Zingdoor was used as the first stage backdoor. And then in later stages of the attack routine, we were able to see successive deployments of other backdoors through preceding installations, Zingdoor to SnappyBee and then to Cobalt Strike. However, this was not always the order of the deployment. There was also instances where preceding attacks was cleaned up by the succeeding one, like in the case of Cobalt Strike removing SnappyBee shortly after it was deployed. Unquote. Now, this flexibility ties into what I, or maybe others do as well, but what I call operational culture. And it's how a group runs things. Western military-style cyber operations, for example, follow really strict rules. They've got go, no-go conditions, heavy prep, and a focus on stealth, and only hitting targets tied to like a specific mission. Salt Typhoon? Not so much. They and other groups like them, they cast a wider net. They scan huge chunks of the internet looking for anything vulnerable, especially in early operations. It's less disciplined and more freewheeling. I think the technical term for this is called cowboying. They've got room to improvise, which can make them unpredictable, but it also can get you caught faster. Now, SnappyBee also has some other connections as well. It's also known as DDRAT, and it's thought to be the next step after another sample called ShadowPad was used. Now, a quick detour. ShadowPad popped up in a supply chain attack in Pakistan, and it was using sneaky, malicious DLLs through a legit signed executable. Does that sound familiar? Now, for now, let's just say that their toolbox and styles aren't entirely unique, and there's overlap worth exploring. So let's do that. Now, one of the data points that was used to attribute Salt Typhoon to China was the shared infrastructure and tooling with other known Chinese APTs. I'm going to read a quote from ESET. It's the report on the hotel infections in which they outline their findings on the topic. Also, as a note, Famous Sparrow is the ESET name given to Salt Typhoon. Quote, while we consider Famous Sparrow to be a separate entity, we found connections to other known APT groups. In one case, attackers deployed a variant of Motnug, which is a loader used by Sparkling Goblin. In another case, on a machine compromised by Famous Sparrow, we found a running Metasploit with cdn.kkxx888666.com as its CNC or C2 server. This domain is related to a group known as DRB Control. End quote. Now, Sparkling Goblin is a Chinese-based APT that's tracked by ESET. Trim Micro calls them Earth Baku. They aren't heavily reported on as they target lower profile victims in like education in Hong Kong and similar US organizations. Maybe they're like an up and coming APT group that we'll hear about more in the future. This group also has connections to WinNTI or Winity. I don't know exactly how that's said. I've only read it, but it's another notorious group that probably warrants a future episode. I don't want to get bogged down on other attacker stuff, but the other named group was DRB Control, in which they shared a command and control server with, but that also has WinNTI connections. Now, along those same lines, in 2023, during this campaign I just talked about, being from November 2022 to November 2023, another group was observed sharing infrastructure with Salt Typhoon. And that group was tracked as UNC4841. And not to confuse anyone, as I'm throwing around a lot of names, but Google Mandiant has a different naming structure to their CTI operations. They use APT, FIN, UNC, etc., etc. And in a nutshell, data points are clustered until they feel confident in graduating them up to be an APT, like APT41, or a FIN group, like FIN7. And APTs being advanced persistence, while FINs being financially motivated. And UNCs are just kind of groups where they haven't made a delineation yet. So in this case, Mandiant, at the time of this recording, tracks Salt Typhoon as UNC2286. And in this report that I'm about to quote, and that I'll link through to, Google Mandiant describes a campaign in which the other group, UNC4841, is pwning Barracuda ESG devices or email security gateways, which may be alarming to some of you listening since it does have the name security in it. But for those of us that's been in the trenches for a while, it's not all that surprising, unfortunately. And for our purposes, this was another bug found in an edge device that was actively exploited by Chinese actors prior to it being disclosed or discovered by the vendors. But I'm going to go through this quote right now so we can use that to build our mental model. Quote, early in our investigation, we identified overlaps in infrastructure used by UNC4841 with that which we have associated with UNC2286, another China Nexus actor that we have observed active since at least 2019 and which has heavily targeted organizations in Southeast Asia region. Activity Mandiant has attributed to UNC2286 overlaps with public reporting on Ghost Emperor, Kaspersky, and Famous Sparrow, ESET. While this finding does indicate a connection in the infrastructure used by both groups, it's likely an artifact of a shared infrastructure anonymization service or an infrastructure provider that is common between the two. End quote. So this hints at the possibility of another service, organization, team, someone setting up infrastructure for these operations. In my opinion, this division of labor represents a sophistication and process put in place by the attackers, especially communication between the groups to deconflict and possibly not step on each other's shoes, which is a troubling sign if you're an adversary to China. Because it would appear that they're taking some of the knowledge learned from their incredibly huge manufacturing base and meat space and applying some of these system principles to their cyberspace operations. In other words, they're starting to get their together. Salt Typhoon's next campaign took place between October 2023 to September 2024. And like their previous attacks, the victims are mostly comprised of telecommunication providers in Taiwan, Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, and now the United States. Now, my personal opinion here, but I would assume that these attacks aren't just limited to like APAC and the United States. It wouldn't be much of a surprise to find samples in Canada, Latin America, and even parts of Africa, especially countries in the Belt and Road Initiative. This campaign was also where Ghost Spider was first discovered, although there have since been earlier versions of it discovered after they found this version. Now, this campaign also includes changes to the DaemonX rootkit, so it no longer relied on a PowerShell script to deploy its additional items. It was all bundled in a cap file. Now, Ghost Spider and DaemonX are interesting samples because there's evidence that both of these pieces of malware are developed by the same team or possibly the same person. Maybe this is a third-party software provider for the Chinese government, third-party-ish, I guess. Maybe it's a team in the PLA or the MSS, or just some talented .NET and C++ developer. Now, those two languages being what the samples are written in, of course. Now, in addition to that, both these samples were tied to an individual targeted host name. And this is some like execution guardrails in action. DaemonX requires the host name for a payload to decrypt, and Ghost Spider checks for a hard-coded host name prior to it doing its fun stuff on disk and in memory. Now, speaking of Ghost Spider, I think this is a good time to get into the weeds of the sample. And I want to give props to Trip Micro again for their analysis of this malware. This sample is complex. It does a lot of stuff to obfuscate itself and the actions it does on the endpoint. I'll link through to it, but with that being said, this portion is mostly derived from the work of that team. As discussed earlier, how the attackers get in, it varies, mostly through the use of popping edge devices. But once they're on the network, the attackers or attacker uses regservice32.exe to install the first stage of the DLL with a generic name like core.dll or spider.dll as a service. And that's part of how it got the name Ghost Spider. Now, this stager includes a hard-coded host name to ensure that it only runs on the intended target. Now, from a CTI perspective, this is useful as we can get a clue that this malware was specifically targeted to this organization and to this machine. If it's only a couple hosts with names from the same organization, that lets us know that this attack is like highly targeted and the attackers have done some level of recon to get those names. They could have a foothold inside the network or deem these hosts the crown jewels or key terrain, or maybe these hosts are like visible from the internet, or maybe there's some type of insider threat that's giving them this information. Meanwhile, if they're using like a top level domain like us.whitehouse.gov or something like that, then we know the attackers are targeting the White House systems, but they don't really have any direct names. Kind of like what we observed with the CC Cleaner supply chain attack. Now, the attackers do execution guardrail techniques for a few reasons. First, it doesn't burn your campaign early. Second, it's a gift to the researchers that are trying to analyze it. And third, it prevents the malware from kind of unintended consequences. Attackers don't want to infect themselves, or they don't want to like let their ransomware/wiper knock out critical infrastructure for like half the globe. That's a bad look, and that gets a lot of people mad. The malware then connects to its command and control server to register communications and to establish, hey, I have a new infection. Now, the command and control server then sends another DLL to be downloaded by the infected host called login.dll. Now, login.dll conducts some reconnaissance on the infected host, reporting back additional information to be stored on the platform and possibly utilized by the attacker. And after this recon DLL does its reconning, it goes into a polling mode. Now, in this polling mode, it continuously checks the C2 or the command and control server for new payloads or instructions from the attacker. Then the next stage that was observed is called loader.dll. And to execute this payload, the attacker utilizes DLL search order hijacking. The loader.dll, the one placed next to the legitimate binary, acts as the Ghost Spider module responsible for launching the beacon payload. Now, persistence is established by a scheduled task, nothing extraordinary here. The loader.dll isn't interesting, though, because it contains an encrypted .NET DLL payload called client.dll. Now, this client.dll payload is decrypted and executed in memory, and this makes things fun, as you need a way to dump the memory to get that payload for analysis. So if you're running some bad EDR, you'll see this, and chances are it'll dump the process for you and its alerts. However, infrastructure like telecommunication providers typically aren't running that. Now, this is a personal biased opinion here, but if you want to get a rough estimate of what systems and industries are running newer EDR, look at who is complaining and had outages when CrowdStrike shipped their blue screen of death to a bunch of people. Like I said, putting their judgments in EDR aside, you didn't hear too many ISPs or telecommunication companies being impacted. And this is just a rough model to base this off of. The beacon in Ghost Emperor uses 6 codes to control the implant. Code 1, upload, so you can upload things to the infected host from the server. Code 2, create, which is like a new operation or maybe create a new connection. Code 3 is normal, transmit data to perform a standard action. Code 4, close, terminate the operation or connection. Code 5 is a heartbeat, which is like a regular check-in with the command and control server. And then code 6 is update, which is you would update the beacon's communication interval back. So maybe you would slow it down or speed it up. Now, with this functionality, it can hoover up data and do its thing as being a spy. But let's talk about this from a more general standpoint for a couple minutes. Using this modular architecture that Ghost Spider uses and has a different module for each function is kind of a pain. Furthermore, using dynamic fetching allows these models to be pulled from this command and control server and loaded directly into memory. So this gives them numerous benefits. It allows them to be flexible. The attackers can easily add and remove or update individual components without redeploying the entire beacon. And this facilitates quick adjustments to the beacon's capabilities in response to like changing needs of the environment. In other words, it's highly adaptable. Additionally, this methodology hinders detection and analysis by making it incredibly hard to grasp the entire full functionality of the beacon in any single component. Analysts usually have fragmented parts of the chain, and it takes a lot of resources to put the entire thing together. Or IT teams find a piece of the chain, they delete it, thinking they saved the day, only to have the attackers re-upload another component, this time being more stealthy. And lastly, this reduces the footprint. It minimizes the size of the core beacon, making it less obvious on disk. Now, overall, this architecture is very smart. Despite Salt Typhoon and Chinese APTs not being afraid to roll their own payloads written in like C++ or .NET or C# frameworks, they also have some Go here and there, but they also utilize Meterpreter payloads and Cobalt Strike beacons in some instances. And going back to like our mental model that we're building on Salt Typhoon, this represents one of two things. Either a level of maturity in picking the right tool for the job, saving their custom stuff for more important targets and using generic stuff for less important targets, or maybe targets with like no security in place. Or option 2 is that the attackers vary in skill level, and this is like different crews being cycled around for the MSS. I personally don't have enough data to lead one way or another in my model, but I'm just thinking out loud here. So like the previous campaigns, this one relied on DMX and Ghost Spider, and it targeted similar victims. But there was also some more similarities. The infrastructure shared the same whois registrant information, and both of them used this VPN called Salt Ether. And there's clues that the infrastructure was being used by another Chinese APT group as well. And there's also some operational mistakes observed. From the Trim Micro report titled Game of Emperor Unveiling Long-Term Earth Estuary Cyber Intrusions, they highlight some of this. Quote, we found that the DMX command and control domain has been used to target a Southeast Asian government agency for several years. However, on August 28, 2024, we detected a network connection to that server from a compromised server belonging to a Southeast Asian telecommunications company. We speculate that the attacker may have made a mistake while deploying the backdoor. Currently, we observe that the attacker's primary use of the DemonX command and control domain, infraredsend.com, and imap.dateupdate to target multiple Southeast Asian telecommunication companies. During our investigation of this campaign, we discovered that the Ghost Spider backdoor, while tracking the command and control infrastructure related to Ghost Spider, we found that the attacker had also tested Ghost Spider on the Open Directory command and control server we observed previously. End quote. Now, it can get a little difficult to keep track of your files as you're compiling them, staging them, and packing them. So maybe that's what happened here. But it does help in linking the threat actors and showing how active they have been. Now, the testing on the open server was probably convenient at the time as no one was really aware of Ghost Spider's existence, but coupled with how long they used that server, it's risky to keep something exposed that's showing signs of compromise that researchers are looking for while being used to conduct operations. But then again, maybe they don't care. Now we approach the timeline and modern attacks carried out by Salt Typhoon. Speaking on a personal level, this isn't where I'm the most comfortable. I like to have more time to validate information, read books, and do longer form research on these attacks and process data points when the dust settles. But part of this podcast experiment is pushing myself out of my comfort zone, so let's do this. But I think it'll be apparent quickly why I like to take my time and digest topics. When researching this episode and even drawing inspiration to tackle this topic, I found myself getting frustrated at the careless reporting and the hyperbole from elected officials, all to garner headlines, I guess, in an effort to be the biggest tough on China person. Or maybe they just build their brand on social media with sound bites and give the reporters something to headline. But there's a series of nuanced paragraphs that came out in one of the quote-unquote respected newspapers about the Salt Typhoon telecommunication provider attack that everyone, well, almost everyone, covering this topic glosses over. In the article titled, quote, "Top Senator Calls Salt Typhoon Worst Telecom Hack in Our Nation's History," the severity of the Chinese breach highlights the need for more telecommunications regulations, lawmakers say, end quote, by Aline Nakashiba. Man, it's always more regulations. Anyway, there's a series of paragraphs buried deep past the senator's headlines, grabbing remarks that explain the situation in relation to the wiretapping capabilities and the root of the problem. Oh, and in case you're wondering who the senator was, it was Mark Warner, the Democrat senator from Virginia, if you care. I think his comments have merit, I guess, but calling this the worst cyber attack is a bit of a stretch, as we haven't even seen any outcomes attributed to this attack, at least disclosed publicly. He said that the Colonial Pipeline attack looked like child's play. I would argue that that had more tangible effects on the population. People were in lines for hours, sometimes just because of fear. Highways were backed up. It was a real mess. It's entirely possible that he has non-publicly disclosed information that paints a different picture, but so far, we just know that they have the data, but the Chinese government also has the data from numerous other high-profile attacks that has data being stolen. As I said in my episode titled Cyber War is Me War, shameless plug, the real benefit to cyber war is that the arena of like total war or unrestricted war, as the Chinese would call it, coupling with like other actions of influence to garner some type of influence for the population. Think media propaganda, financial warfare, or just good old-fashioned psyops. I'm getting away from the point here. But I'll read the often overlooked paragraphs from this article. Quote, "The Salt Typhoon hack is seen by government officials as an espionage operation rather than pre-positioning for critical infrastructure sabotage. Hackers have acquired access to the system that logs U.S. law enforcement requests for criminal wiretaps, allowing the Chinese to know who is of interest to authorities. There is no evidence so far that hackers have compromised the collection system itself through which law enforcement listens in on wiretap calls," said U.S. officials, speaking on the condition of anonymity because of the matter's sensitivity. The calls of which Chinese hackers were able to listen in on were not part of the lawful intercept or wiretap system, officials said. The hackers also had access to unencrypted communications, including text messaging. End-to-end encrypted communications, such as those on Signal platform, are believed to be protected, officials said. The Post previously reported that the hackers were able to reconfigure Cisco routers to exfiltrate data from Verizon networks. End quote. So let's dissect all of this. The first statements of this being espionage rather than pre-positioning for critical infrastructure is to draw a line between the Chinese group known as Vault Typhoon and this group, Salt Typhoon. I'll do something on Vault Typhoon in the future, but the TLDR on them is that they've compromised utilities and cell phone providers in places like Guam, which appear to be like an OPE campaign. Now, and OPE stands for Operational Preparedness of the Environment. It's to prepare the battlefield, essentially to help the military personnel prepare for potential military operations. In cyber war, this is like staging implants, and I guess like dragging anchors for 50 miles to accidentally tear out undersea communications cables. Then there's the part that states, well, I guess I'll just reread it. Hackers have acquired access to the system that logs U.S. law enforcement requests for criminal wiretaps, allowing the Chinese to know who is of interest to the authorities. So contrary to this haphazard reporting of the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, or CALEA, compromise, it's only the logs of the communications, specifically who is the target and probably the agency requesting it. Now, from an intel perspective, this is super useful, but the error is believing that they're using this easy to drop in on calls, which they don't really have to because they've already said it's all unencrypted. At least the stuff held by telecommunications providers, SMS messages and phone calls. Now, iMessage and Signal, WhatsApp are probably safe from the attackers. And I feel like people are using this as like an argument for like no backdoors in products, which I'm all for. But this isn't the use case for such arguments. It's not what's being used here. The argument here is to improve American infrastructure and telecommunications equipment. Also, making it domestically is an acceptable solution, I guess. But then there's like the cost and regulations, and that's an entire episode not on Salt Typhoon anymore. But this is the problem with the infrastructure and, well, most of the infrastructure in the United States in general. It's old, dated, and the debt, in this case tech debt, is catching up with us fast. Being the first mover and putting infrastructure in place to allow the United States to be technologically connected and be a nation that's connected faster than others had its benefits. But these protocols and infrastructure were set up at a time where security and encryption were not considered. I guess people had more faith in humanity back then. The reality is they probably didn't see the internet and IT exploding how it did. Now, much like in today's world where everyone's goal is to innovate fast, fail often, security is often lacking. I think it's because very few people think about the second and third order effects of their innovations or pushes to cloud. But then again, I'm not a founder and I don't have $1 million morning routine, so I guess I don't really know. And I'm not faulting the people developing this stuff in like the 1980s and 90s. Encryption standards weren't what they are today. There wasn't robust algorithms. And I have serious doubts that like CPU compute could even do it in the first place. SS7, signaling system number 7, was developed in the 70s, and it's all plain text. Even newer protocols like RCS, which is Rich Communication Services, it varies in implementation. It can be hard to encrypt group chats, and the spec didn't explicitly state that all communications had to be encrypted, although I think there are efforts to change that. I'm not a telephony expert, but I've dabbled in the past with critical infrastructure. RCS is just a newer protocol, and it has encryption in certain cases, but it's not encrypted in certain cases. But to fix this, it's hard. Very, very, very hard. Of the major telecommunications providers disclosed, you have to assume that the subcarriers and smaller names under them are also compromised. Furthermore, you need to realize that the attackers could be buried deep in a vast array of switches, routers, and endpoints. One missed backdoor can lead to all of this happening again. And I don't envy the teams doing this work or to trying to remediate this or trying to evict these actors. So what should you do? Well, it's probably a good practice to use Signal or iMessage in general. I'm an Apple dude, but I guess you could use WhatsApp as well. You may believe Zuck, the NSA, or someone is eavesdropping on you and your friends' spicy memes, but the reality is they probably are. As we saw in this attack, the attackers targeted a limited number of devices, mostly those of prominent individuals like the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and Vice President Harris's campaign. There were something like 100 devices in total. If there is a silver lining to this, the Chinese operation looks to be measured and disciplined. They didn't ransomware the entire network to disrupt it. It was good old-fashioned intelligence gathering. The reality is that every nation conducts these like types of operations, and this is a juicy target. The real question is, what do they do with the data? As I hinted at earlier in the episode, you could probably use some true data points, present the receipts, and craft your own narrative to force feed down a population's throat via your social media app of choice, all while silencing the other side or their rebuttals. Information warfare, public psyops. There's only one avenue. You could use the information for targeted attacks as well. You could data mine public sentiment on attacks or blackmail prominent figures. All of that's on the table. Could maybe even help you get human assets in places of power or close to power. Remember how I talked about Congressman Swalwell? There's also allegations against Linda Sun, an aide to Governor Hochul and Cuomo in New York. Now, Sun allegedly pushed Chinese interests from the Big Apple and influenced the governor as well. And this isn't just confined to China or any country specifically, but in my previous AMA episode on the TikTok ban, I touched on this topic a little bit. But I think I'll unwind this more in like an addendum episode for this series. But going back to this attack, I think it's likely that they had been in the networks for a while and that they've only recently been caught. Think about if this occurred in like 2021 and they have like unrestricted access to the personal emails of think tanks advising the president on like Chinese relations, or a lobbyist for a Taiwan chip manufacturer, or an SMS MFA to like a CEO in like a big organization. I hope they aren't using SMS-based MFA, but hey, who knows? Then, as the news cycle moved on, we got news of a new attack on a prominent U.S. institution, the United States Treasury. Oh joy. In late December 2024, the United States Treasury announced that they had been victims of Salt Typhoon as well. The breached systems, managed by an external vendor, Beyond Trust in this case, provided remote technical support to the organization. Now, the attackers obtained the credentials used for the support, allowing them to access certain Treasury employees' workstations. Now, this breach enabled the review of unclassified documents. The Beyond Trust Remote Support, RS, and the Privileged Remote Access, PRA systems had two undiscovered vulnerabilities in them. Now, both vulnerabilities included command injection, where attackers can execute arbitrary commands on these host systems, either through direct unauthenticated access, CVE 2024-12356, or by leveraging the existing administrative access, CVE 2024-12686. Now, from there, they were able to get legit credentials from the abuse of the vulnerabilities and started hoovering up anything that wasn't nailed down. But the United States Treasury and, well, the U.S. government didn't take this one laying down. Right off the attacks of the telecommunications providers and multiple congressional hearings on the matter, DC's patience was wearing thin. In response to this attack, fresh sanctions were issued on a Chinese organization and an individual. Oh, and I'm going to do my best not to butcher these names, but I barely speak English coherently, so this could get rough. The company, Shishin Zhuijing Net Technology, was sanctioned for having quote-unquote direct involvement in or with the Salt Typhoon cyber group. The individual, Ye Zhizhang, was sanctioned for his involvement in a recent compromise of the Department of Treasury's network. Now, Yin is identified as a cyber actor with more than a decade of experience affiliated with the Chinese Ministry of State Security, the MSS. Oh, and he was said to have direct involvement as well. There's no receipts to say, publicly at least, to suggest what his involvement was. Maybe it'll come out one day, but right now we're kind of forced to speculate. I'm not trying to say there's some grand conspiracy here or something. I'm just saying that this is an ongoing investigation and details are pretty sensitive. So let's unpack this a bit though. To have direct involvement, you typically need to be an active participant in that company, or the individual was actively engaged in executing cyber operations. Now, this could involve writing or deploying the malware, conducting reconnaissance, or directly hacking into the system itself. Or you could just be providing operational support, which is essentially like providing infrastructure or services that were used by the group for these attacks. This could be like the hosting services or providing IP addresses or managing the command and control servers. And it's a little weird if you had like an LLC equivalent style company that was like hosting malware and attacker infrastructure, but I guess stranger things have happened. Then this could also be like a case of collaboration or coordination with the group, including like sharing intelligence or like planning attacks or providing advice on like strategic targets or methods. Direct involvement could also mean like resource provisioning or supplying resources like the vulnerabilities themselves, or like supplying exploit kits or other tools that were used. And this is a little bit of a gray area in sometimes. And in some cases, I don't think this is the case here, but this could also mean that they like facilitated access to the networks or the systems that were breached, meaning like they were an insider or they had credentials that were exploited and shared with the group. Additionally, there's like direct financial backing or logistical support, basically giving funds or being able to procure equipment for the cyber group to do their thing. Maybe it's like laundering funds as well. And then lastly, there could be like evidence of communication, either like digital or physical evidence like email or chat logs or messages in a bottle, who knows, but coordination between the sanctioned entities and the cyber groups. So as you can see, there's many ways to kind of get lumped into those sanctions for direct action. Now, the reality is that these sanctions, like many sanctions of this type, are largely symbolic. The Chinese government isn't in a hurry to extradite anyone, and the company likely isn't going to face any fines from the CCP. I mean, it's China. The CCP owns the company anyway. But with these sanctions in place, Salt Typhoon kind of went dormant, possibly getting ready for like Chinese New Year, or so I thought. Then, as I was finalizing the script, a new report came out that Salt Typhoon was still pwning ISPs. Recorded Future released an article highlighting Salt Typhoon's use of vulnerabilities in edge devices to get ISPs against ISPs and universities. Now, at this point in the episode, you probably shouldn't be too surprised. The NSCIT group put out a report titled Red Mike, Salt Typhoon exploits vulnerable Cisco devices of global telecommunications providers, end quote. And I hope I'm saying that name right. I've only ever read it. And this group does a lot of great work. But the report details the specifics of how the group has leveraged the two vulnerabilities with CVEs dating back to 2023 to gain access to over 1,000 targets worldwide. Now, Salt Typhoon exploited two critical privilege escalation vulnerabilities in the Cisco iOS XE software. CVE 2023-20198, which allowed attackers to gain initial access through the web user interface, the UI, of the router. And then there was CVE 2023-20273, which was used to achieve root level access after the initial compromise. But hey, at least it wasn't hard-coded credentials. All joking aside, that's a bad Cisco joke, I guess. But this is like a Linux operating system that's under the Cisco pieces. So dumping creds would be similar to like how you would do it on a Linux-based host. And then post-exploitation, the group established generic routing encapsulation, GRE, tunnels to maintain persistence and data exfiltration. Now, this campaign hit telecom networks in multiple countries with confirmed breaches in the United States, including an affiliate of a UK telecom provider and a US ISP, South Africa, Italy, Thailand, Myanmar, specifically Mytel, which is like a major telecom provider there. There were also universities in several countries targeted. That includes universities in Argentina, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, Mexico, the Netherlands, Thailand, the United States, and Vietnam, likely to access research in various technologies. Cisco Talos put out a blog post titled Weathering the Storm in the Midst of a Typhoon, which I'll link through to, in which they describe the tradecraft used by Salt Typhoon in some of these attacks and the nuance involved with networking equipment used in telecommunications companies. They also go through a lot of effort to make it clear that these are not new Cisco vulnerabilities that were discovered via this campaign. Instead, it was vulnerabilities from a couple of years ago, like I said previously. It's kind of a weird dynamic they're put into. On one hand, they are presumably experts in this tradecraft used in Cisco devices and network devices. But on the other hand, these bugs are from like Cisco, as in Cisco Talos, the company that like pays your paycheck. So with that being said, like once you get past kind of the tiptoeing of that line in this report, this gives a glimpse into the tradecraft that's used. And honestly, some of it's pretty impressive. In general, one of the main TTPs this group has used has been stolen credentials, which is not always clear how they get it. In this report, though, it does shed some light on how. Being on the network devices, they would have visibility into like credentials moving across the wire, especially like SNMP, TACAS, and radius traffic. And then some of the other tradecraft used involved a custom Golang utility called Jumble Path. Let's read an excerpt from the report to describe what this utility does. Quote, The threat actor used a custom-built utility dubbed Jumble Path, which allowed them to execute a packet capture on a remote Cisco device through an actor-defined jump host. This tool also attempted to clear logs and impair logging along the jump path and return the resultant compressed encrypted capture via another unique series of actor-defined connections or jumps. This allowed the threat actor to create a chain of communications and perform the capture on a remote device. The use of this utility would help to obfuscate the original source, ultimate destination of the request, and would also allow its operator to move through the potentially otherwise non-public reachable or routable devices or infrastructure. End quote. I mean, we're getting into some sophisticated actions here. This stuff takes time to learn and build applications for. And this last bit of tradecraft I want to highlight was how the attackers would modify the loopback addresses of a compromised switch and then use that as the source of an SSH connection to bypass access controls and pivot to previously inaccessible devices. That's a clever tactic. It definitely represents another layer of issues when you're trying to evict them from a network and with network devices. Now, this report has a ton of great information in it, and I couldn't do it justice in this setting. But the last item I wanted to bring up was in the form of the detections. Cisco Talos writes great reports, and I love how they give detection methods and preventative measures along with the normal industry standard IOCs at the end of their reports. But one of the detection methods here was looking for abnormally large bash history files, and I just thought this was like an out-of-the-box method that isn't discussed often. Like I said, I'll link through to this report if you want to check it out. And that brings us up to the present, March 2025, which I think is a great place to start wrapping this episode up. Salt Typhoon illustrates the expansion in both scale and maturity for cyber operations, specifically espionage that is currently a priority for China. This could be in preparation for reclaiming Taiwan, which is the popular opinion, but it could be a way for China to establish themselves as like the world leader or a near-peer world leader, or even surpass the United States. Another stated goal. The point is that there could be many reasons, and I'd like to unpack that more in an addendum episode I'll release in the coming weeks. This episode has gotten long enough, and there's a little that's kind of out of scope for the purposes here. Needless to say, the Salt Typhoon series will likely be multiple episodes as details emerge and the group continues their conquests. Being tied to the MSS, this represents a clear division from the historic operations that fell under the PLA umbrella. As we have seen with the release of DeepSeek, China is definitely in the great AI race, and America's lead is much smaller than we presumed. And this is despite any efforts to slow their progress down through sanctions and regulations of chips. With these advanced models, these analysts tasked with sorting this information, translating it, and weaponizing it have a much faster pipeline. It's not replacing the analysts, just the analysts that knows how to use AI are replacing those that don't. As Naval Ravikant has said multiple times, the models and agents are essentially natural language computers, meaning you don't need to know C++ or Python or R or SQL or whatever to get the computer to do what you want it to do. It's not as turnkey as we make it out to be, but it's still very early. And with that, I think this is a good place to end. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like, share, subscribe to it within your favorite podcast app or social media player or wherever podcasts are shared. It only takes a moment of your time, and in return, I'll continue to do my best in producing the show. These episodes take between 20 and 40 hours of research and multiple more hours behind the scripts, refining them, editing them, and scoring the track before it's released. Also, I have a mailing list that you could sign up for at IntrusionsInDepth.com. You'll get notified when new episodes drop, as well as calls for questions in my periodic AMA episodes, and you'll get first dibs on questions to ask upcoming guests. While you're here, feel free to check out any of my earlier episodes on cyber attacks and the threat actors that conduct them. I'm Josh Depp. Thanks for listening.